Hey everybody, welcome back to Grace in the Gray podcast, where we use the black and white of Scripture to speak truth into the gray areas of our culture. I am Rick, and I am joined by
Ben Lee.
James, not Lee.
Nice. And we are still missing Sam, still away on her civic duty, filling out a jury. So praying for justice in that. Hope all goes well for you, Sam, and praying that you get some good free lunches. I think they give you $15 a day now, or something like that is the going rate for jury duty lunch. I don't remember
when I did it.
They
brought something in, maybe? I don't know.
I got dismissed by the defense.
They didn't like the look at you.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess they were like, yeah, we're not putting the pastor dude on the jury. So
I made it past that screening for some reason. Yeah. I'm not a pastor, though, so that makes sense.
They could tell you were pretty morally corruptible.
Yeah. I got that look. That dude's got some no good in his heart.
Well, if you're joining us for this episode and it's your first, I would really encourage you to back up. We started a really cool conversation in our last episode, really looking on the importance of words. And that kind of morphed into this conversation about traditional church, contemporary church, and the reason that some of those words have maybe migrated from the traditional sense of their past usage in more traditional churches to the way that contemporary and progressive thinking churches have sought synonymous words, or however we would term that. And so just a cool conversation that we were used to discussing that. I'll ask this question. For you personally, and maybe this question will be really easy to answer because of where we work, but if you were to align yourself and your desire for either traditional or contemporary when it comes to church style and worship style, which side of that card would you fall on? And I guess we could even put dress in there if you want to. If anybody feels really passionate that you want to bring back suits and ties, we could do that as well.
Yeah. Is it okay if it's different depending on what we're talking about?
Yeah, go ahead.
So
that's what I was hoping for. That's where I'm going to fall too, I think.
Dress, I know lots of people will disagree with me, and I'm completely comfortable with that. I think dress for me is a really important avenue of self-expression, and I see value in being able to exercise that avenue even in the sacred place of the church, which I do believe is a sacred place, but I don't believe we live in a time culturally where the previously held values that you clean yourself up before you come to the sacred place is still something that's equally culturally meaningful as it has been in the past, but I will merit that it has been that way. As far as music...
You hate all of it?
Yeah. Well, that's the crazy thing. I love music. But I love music as an art form. And because of that, church music, in most cases, don't jump down my throat, James, because I know you happen to listen to some artists that kind of defy that.
We'll circle back.
Yeah, but for me, because it's an art form and most music used for the purposes of worship is not... first and foremost an art form, it's, what would you say, a participatory agent is what I would call it. It's something written to encourage response, whether emotional or physical. I love the act of worship. I love congregational worship. I do not enjoy worship music as an art form, and that's how I consume most music.
Okay.
So for music, I'm kind of indifferent as far as old or new, contemporary or traditional. I've been a part of both environments. Most of my life has been spent in the contemporary environment. Obviously, I was raised for the most part in this church, but when I was in college, I went to both types of services, and I went to blended. I served in a blended church for a while. Blended meaning contemporary and traditional worship elements.
A choir with a drum kit?
Yeah, that's pretty much. Or a special that was performed by a band, but everything else was like choir with track or something like that. What were the other categories, like preaching?
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like that's a hard one to really delineate a clean line in. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because I think preaching style is less dictated by traditional versus contemporary and more dictated by denomination.
Yeah.
But there are some things that are more commonly found in, what would you say, contemporary environments. But I think on the whole, I would say traditional, maybe.
I don't know. I think you, like, and this could be completely off base, but just based off of discussions, I feel like you enjoy somebody that would almost, and I don't know which of those two camps, it doesn't really fit this clean, like almost someone who teaches and even preaches almost with a philosophical bent to it. Like,
Oh, yeah.
like looking maybe a little bit deeper than I'm going to try to boil this down into something that you can take home, which is applicational. But it's also, that's usually what people do even when they exegete. And I think some of that, like, you enjoy, at least when I've listened to you talk about the people that you listen to and just the way that you read, like a teacher that would almost present options, you know what I mean, as these things are.
But that's the struggle, right? Is I struggle just like everybody else does with what I think is best for me versus what I consume for entertainment purposes. And it's really easy for me to say, I prefer sermons that fit the mold for what entertains me most. And something that's super intellectually stimulating is going to be what I prefer, but it may not be what's best for me.
That's good. James, what you got?
So I've got I think, a interesting answer to all this, because at different times in my spiritual journey, in my relationship with different churches, I have had a great deal of passion for multiple sides of different degrees of contemporary versus traditional.
Yeah.
For one, I'm a pianist and an organist. So it's been great. The story of me growing up in church with my piano teacher being the pianist, and then eventually, filling roles with her, and then later on in place of her, in this church that I had lots of like security and stability, and the relationships with the people that were there. Lots of great things about that in a traditional leaning blended kind of worship approach. Like you said, the preaching has kind of been consistent across all things. Here at Cedar Creek, it's definitely a little more low-key, a little more applicational. So I'd say that's different. At different times in my life, I still have a tie rack at home with lots of great ties that I selected myself and used to rotate between, but not because anybody told me to, but because that's what I felt like I should do. So I did, and I enjoy doing it. At this point in my life, like what I'm wearing now, I have worn on Sunday mornings, no questions asked, no issues. I don't know that anybody would have had too much to say. I didn't challenge it, but in the church I grew up in,
that's never a helpful question to go, does anybody have anything to say in our culture today? I'm like, that's just open yourself.
They do.
Yeah, they always do.
And they're mad for some reason.
Well, and I'm not going to ask that question. I'm going to say, what's wrong with what I'm wearing?
That's also very dangerous.
What exactly is your problem with?
Yeah.
How about this for a fun tidbit? Because I was raised in the contemporary environment, and because of the fact that unlike you and Dad, I'm not ordained. I don't do like weddings or funerals or anything like that, and that's fine. I don't want to. That's a lot of pressure, but I own more ties than I've ever worn in my life. Nice. They're like hand-me-downs, or some of them I think like just materialized in my closet. They're there. I just never wear a tie.
I need a fun tidbit. I'm kind of similar but different. I don't have that many ties, and every time that I need to put on a tie for a funeral or a wedding or whatever it may be, fancy dinner, whatever we're going to, I cannot remember how to tie them, and I've done enough that I should, and so every single time I'm rolling out a YouTube video. Yeah, I'm YouTube videoing that thing, and it takes me like 3 to 4 attempts before I get it the right length.
That's funny because you wear a tie vastly more than me, but I can tie it.
I also want to share this tidbit, and I hope that I understand this correctly. I was exactly this many days old in my life when I learned that an organ is not just a piano with pipes. I have assumed my entire life that the person is just playing the piano, and it just sounds different because it's coming out of those massive metal pipes, the same as you could like change the button on a keyboard to make it, play different funky sounds when you press it, like wingdings as a font. You could do that on a keyboard.
They're pretty substantially different. I would say a piano is as different from an organ as a
violin
is from a piano.
Really?
Maybe? Yeah.
That different?
Yeah.
I never knew. So I guess I have to turn in my Baptist.
As almost like as a trumpet is from a guitar.
Yeah, it is. It's a wind instrument as opposed to a percussion instrument.
Or a stringed instrument.
Yeah, so I won't go too far out into the weeds, but since you brought that up,
Oh God, somebody stop him!
my language.
this is a tidbit that's also a question I have.
We're just full of tidbits today, boys.
So you talk about the role that music plays in worship and how that looks different in these different contexts. If you go far into organ music, you're going to eventually come across Johann Sebastian Bach. He's the Old Testament of classical music. Beethoven is considered the New Testament of classical music. That's as far down that road as I'll go. But
For now,
yeah, what Bach accomplished in his writing for organ is just unmatched in history. And one of the things that I've found in the last couple years that I'm really interested in is the fugue. I don't know if you've ever heard that word, if it means anything to you. It's basically, you know how row your boat, if you get enough people, you can all come in at different times.
Yeah.
It's like that, but on steroids, but to the point where it's like a Sudoku puzzle where everything has to fit in place this way and this way in all the rows.
if you're confused at this point, you're correct.
Yeah. If it doesn't make sense to you, you're
I'm a little bit
following me.
nauseated.
So I say that to say
confused and scared.
Bach's life was spent, for the most part, moving between different churches where he was the organist, where he was also the music director, where he composed the things that we now know him for.
Yeah.
And I cannot find in writing anywhere, maybe somebody listening has the answer, what possible liturgical purpose did a fugue serve? Because it's really just a musical experience. It's an idea, and it's like, well, how many different ways can we manipulate this one idea? And I'm like, as somebody who's had to be in an organist type role, I can, not to equate myself with Bach, I can kind of see where there's a need for some functional music. In our setting, we do that with pad and
A little guitar.
yeah, a little guitar,
swells,
maybe
that
some
kind of thing.
keys. Yeah, there's ways to do that, but
No,
I can't find a historical statement on why that existed.
Well, I can find a parallel in art itself, and visual art. We don't do this very often anymore, and some of it is because of the split between Roman Catholic Orthodoxy and Protestantism. But there used to be very rich, ornate design in the building of the church, and these extravagant paintings all over the ceilings. And it wasn't uncommon if a church was formerly Catholic and was taken over by Protestant leadership for them to literally whitewash the walls. So in Protestant circles, it's not uncommon for us to be very, very cautious about imagery and art in general, and to try to separate it from the more somber, reflective, intentionally designed, regimented type environments. I think in all likelihood that kind of ornate instrumentation is probably a result of the fact that artful musical performance was viewed as worship in itself, versus a more Protestant approach of just proclaiming facts about who God is, and it happens to be to music so that you can remember it better. Those are two very different approaches to musical worship, though.
So these two guys are the musically inclined with musical and artistic knowledge. My mind has gone since you said that Bach, and I know very little of him. I've heard some of his stuff, but know very little of him at all. Since you said that he spent his life from church to church, and then you compared him to Beethoven, in my mind, the thought that has not left since you said that is, who was the person that complained when Bach came in and started playing the organ his way versus the way that the person had played it before then? Because if it was church music and it changed it all, somebody complained about it. And so somebody complained because Bach came in and he wasn't playing it, or Beethoven came in and he wasn't playing it the way Bach did.
Yeah.
And so that was the funny man.
In college, I asked my organ teacher the same question.
Yeah.
I said, so everybody loved this, right? He goes, oh, no, it was controversial. I said, oh, so this was 300 years ago, contemporary Christian music.
This was it.
That's the
Here's
funny thing
yeah.
about the discussions over contemporary versus traditional is it's it's all for now. It's all temporary.
And so that was kind of the discussion that I launched off into this episode that I don't know that we've covered a great deal of significant ground, although it's been interesting so far, is
That counts for something.
full disclosure, this entire foundation for this episode in my head is not gossip, but it is a article that I believe is from Barna, and I don't know where it was for sure, because I heard about it in a sermon that I was listening to. So this is the entire foundation of this episode is like fourth or fifth hand of an article that may exist or may not. If we can find it, we'll put it in the show notes. If not, I'm sorry that I led you astray, and I just think it's an interesting, because I have seen this a little bit, that right now among back end of millennials and then Gen Z that's after millennial, the fastest growing segment of the church population is men in those age demographics, and the type of church that they are most rapidly repopulating are the churches who bend more traditionally versus where we've come out of in the late 90s, early 2000s, where everything pushed towards traditional, or towards contemporary rather, as we gave rise to the megachurch movement and those kind of things. And now it's kind of swinging back, like everything does, it's swinging back in the pendulum. And that thought popped into my head as we were talking about words and kind of the value of some of the maybe more traditional ways of thinking versus contemporary ways of thinking and those kind of things. And so I was just going to kind of ask, or maybe have a discussion, what do you think it is about traditional Christianity in America that is drawing in the back half of our generation and then the generation that's after us?
Mm-hmm. That's such like a socially and culturally charged question too.
Yeah.
Because part of me wonders, I'm not confident in this, but I wonder if it's the de-emphasis on masculine hero stories that we've seen of late. Or maybe we haven't seen that of late. I don't know. But that would make sense to me by merit of the fact that you could explain the return to church as a return to what is essentially a masculine hero story. Now understand, when I say masculine hero story or feminine hero story, I'm not saying stories about men that are heroes or stories about women that are heroes. It's a story structure that's different between those two gendered archetypes. Although you can have a masculine hero story about a woman, or you can have a feminine hero story about a man. You think like Joan of Arc, it's a story about a woman, but it's a masculine hero story because she gains her honor by going to war. That's a masculine story. Catwoman.
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean by that. It feels like you just said Catwoman.
That's what I did.
Yeah, but those are archetypical stories. But with the de-emphasis on masculine stories, culturally, we're not as interested in war movies as an example. We may look to other types of stories, but maybe the lack of those kinds of stories in popular culture has pushed men back into an environment where they get to hear of that masculine story of tackling an adventure or being self-sacrificial in love to others, and all those things. But I don't know.
Yeah, and the reason that this sermon that I'd listened to popped back into my mind as we were talking about it was specifically when we were talking about the words and the value that history promotes reverence, right? Like, so when we're talking about words, the historical context of the word and the way that it is carried historically sometimes promotes a reverent approach to it.
Yeah.
When we look at that word, and we were talking specifically about discipleship as the word we were examining then as a word with some weight for the concept we're talking about. And I want you to poke holes, because when I listened to that, I started to give some thought to this question of why do I think that this has been it? And I began to wonder, was it anchored a little bit in what you just shared, Ben? And then do you guys think it's fair because we live in the age of information, and we live in this age where it almost feels that truth is transient, like it's continually moving, that there's nothing that I can approach reverently or hold sacredly or do any of those kind of things, that it creates in us a draw for something that is anchored, that is true, that is sustaining? And then because we're looking for something that's sustaining, that means it stood the test of time, and then we've cast that onto the lens of a more traditional role in the Christian faith.
Yeah, so it could be kind of the pendulum. I think if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're saying it's something like the pendulum swinging back from deconstructionism to something that's more like conservatism.
Yeah.
And I can't necessarily speak for why men are coming back to the church, period, but I can maybe understand a little bit or shed some light on the idea that it's men that are going to conservative environments, just because talking about statistics and tendencies, not individuals, and that's an important distinction. Men are more likely to lean conservative, not conservative politically, conservative in terms of temperament, which means they're going to have more a desire to protect things, more of a desire to keep things the way they currently are and to maintain a status quo. Again, more likely doesn't mean I'm saying exclusively. If you randomly selected a male and a female out of the population, you may have a woman who's comparatively more conservative than a man. It's not uncommon. It's about 80-20% for a single selection. So if you selected 100, you probably get 80 men that are more conservative than their counterparts and 20 women who are more conservative. Anyway, I say all that to say that it would make sense for men to be the ones that are headed back into those like more traditional environments. But as far as why they're headed back to church, that's a little bit more convoluted.
So I've got some thoughts on that. They're purely anecdotal, so I have no research to base this on.
None of us do. I launched this out of a sermon that I vaguely remember in an article that we may or may not be able to cite. So go ahead.
God, we need Sam.
Then I'm either dramatically more credible than you or less. There's no in between. I think that pendulum, it's swinging in a circle. I think maybe it's not a pendulum at all. Maybe it's just something that's...
The merry-go-round?
Yeah, there you go. Where I feel like kind of as you approach the launch of the megachurch type era, contemporary church era, you have people that knew what church was, or at least had an idea of what they thought church was, and understandably in some cases, or based on bad prior experiences or parents with bad prior experiences, said, I'm not touching that. I'm not doing that. And then along came a movement that said, doing that's not the point. Jesus is the point. And you don't have to fall into what you think is this cookie cutter to be a part of what Jesus has for you. And I think that's very attractive, because it does not have to exclude like the spiritual change and growth that you get in a quality church setting of any flavor. But I think at the point where that becomes the dominant thing, then, like I said, I think for the same reasons that people like Jordan Peterson have attracted a big audience, is that maybe unrelated to the church, the culture has had kind of more of a vacuum of people that fill a fatherly type role, whether that's spiritual or practical or just in your own personal development, like a mentor type role. And I think Jordan Peterson has spoken objectively to a huge number of people who needed that type of wisdom or was looking for something that sounded like that type of wisdom. And I think that traditional church fills that same void for people who don't necessarily see the value in what the benefits, in air quotes, might be of a contemporary worship setting. So that's really what I think, because like I said, especially as people start to age, they get into their mid-20s, their late 20s, they start a family, that changes a whole lot about how you feel about things. And I think probably still anecdotal, still no research or basis for this statement. When you have somebody that has that foundation, which I think traditional church gives you much more structure in that. It makes sense to me how someone would be able to click in that environment. And
structure is definitely the operative word when you describe like a more traditional environment, and why that would be the direction that the pendulum swings back to is because right now culturally we do have a lot of subjectivism. We have a lot of postmodernism, which is everything is just a narrative, and there's no centralizing narrative. It's all more or less chaotic by design. So if the pendulum would swing back, it would swing back towards something like a traditional religion.
Yeah, the question that I had, and even listening to you talk, is like the pendulum feels like it swung and the church chased it with the contemporary movement towards this expressive individualism idea, right? Like you be who you are and then fit that into Jesus' story. And there's some weight and some merit to that as long as it fits inside of at least the gospel narrative and forgiven by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. Like that's our traditional Christian understanding that I would say is a hill that we would die on this show.
Well,
right?
and you think about like culturally what was going on at the time that we did finally make the transition to something like the Jesus movement of the 60s and 70s and into the contemporary church. Like in that era, we were at least prior to that, before the free love movement of the 60s and 70s that was outside of the church, you had very, very severe strictures on what you ought to be as a human being. So you do have this pushback against this idea of like, you have value when you do these 5 things, when you have 2 kids, when you get a suburban lifestyle, when you have a job that can provide this type of living standard, when you wear these clothes. Like those are the strictures around who you can be. So the church was willing to push back and say like, that's not what you're being called to. You're being called to something higher and more sacred. But now culturally, we live in an environment where things are very, very different. There are no strictures on what you can and can't
I think it's interesting because I think as the church, and it's historically done this for forever, even going back to Bach and the way that we started the conversation, is like we chase the pendulum, right? I think the church often falls, not victim, but falls into that. And then there's dangers naturally to chasing that pendulum, I think. And most often, I think the danger is that we make sacred things that were never intended to be sacred. And we've done that in a variety of ways. We talked about some of it with the traditional church that led to the contemporary movement because it was more about be these things, dress this way, do these things. And that led to the contemporary movement. It's always funny to me that dress is one of the things that was brought up. And you talked about it when you were going through which way you prefer in the contemporary movement. And then inside of the contemporary movement, the thing that's hysterical for me is when you go to a contemporary church, especially your larger mega churches, everyone dresses the same. It's just not like we just adapted a new style and the style is like, but we all look this way. I used to make fun of, when I was in student ministry, I called it the young life look. Like everybody here is in holy jeans and chacos, right? Like everybody here is rocking that same style. But I think there's kind of the thought in this, whether we're talking about words or strictures or sacraments or different things, like I think there's always a danger if we're not careful, or words and etymological studies, like there's a danger in we make things into dramatically more than they should be. But I think there's also the danger on the flip side of that coin in we eliminate the importance that things should hold in an attempt to make the most important things seem important. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a tough thing, right? Because especially from like a Protestant perspective, you want to make sure that you're maintaining this idea that like Christ is supreme, that Christ is divine, that Christ is everything you need. That's even like a post-Orthodox perspective that I think I would very strongly hold to. But by the same merit, it's like, yes, Christ is 100% sufficient, but like when it comes to some of these like symbols and sacraments, they add value not because Christ was lacking, but because they reveal the value that was always there that I couldn't understand or see as fully. But it's the difference between saying exactly that like these extra things we're adding are adding value to Christ or are somehow supplementing a value that Christ is lacking versus they reveal a value that was always there.
I think there's something beautiful going back to the last episode and when you're doing the etymology of the word disciple, like a learner of, like it's not that it makes Christ more valuable, but it makes you a better learner of Christ. You know what I mean? That's terrible English, but there's something so valuable in that. Man, a greater understanding of Christ as sufficient and what that fully means. And I get that through this participation. Participation in these things that historically we've been commanded to do and have adapted to do as church history that allow us to walk in the fullness of what it means for Christ to be sufficient.
Yeah, so to circle back around not only to words, but to the idea of things changing over time in the church in general, one of the things I would say, just almost wrap up a bunch of what we've already said, is it's okay for things to change over time, but they should change with a couple of things in mind. One, they should change conservatively or cautiously. Maybe I don't want to use the word conservatively because of all the other meaning that's wrapped up in that, but cautiously, intentionally. So some kind of intentional design behind them. and also to promote clarity, not to obfuscate meaning, not to try to trick someone into it. Because that's one of the things I see with like changing terminology in the modern era for the church is like we want to cloud up exactly what you're getting yourself into and give you some kind of like softer popular language so that you can feel safe taking a bite out of this theology, but really you're digging into something much deeper. I think the same is true with changing the way your services are to be safer for people who don't believe in the gospel. And we've always kind of operated on the idea that you it's okay to make changes to the form. It's never okay to make changes to the content. Form would be something like style of preaching, style of music, that kind of thing. Those are the form, but the content is the message that is taught by whoever's preaching or whoever's singing the songs. So yeah, conservatively, intentionally, and to promote clarity, not obfuscate it. Yeah. So that's, I don't know, what do you guys think about that as kind of like a rule of thumb for some of those changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a super good rule of thumb. I also think it's a super cool kind of cap on the last two episodes, because that's kind of where we started. You know what I mean? With the clarity piece of it was kind of where we launched out of the etymology study was, hey, if you're doing this motivated by the means to, even when we were talking about tithing and giving, like out of the motivation of I'm trying to provide clarity to people who might be confused or not have an understanding or a background in this subject matter, that's a great and noble cause, as long as we're seeking to get them to a right understanding, and the right understanding is ultimately where the clarity is.
Yeah.
I think all of those are a beautiful kind of summary of where we've been over the past two talks. I think that's cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Speaking of words that we're kind of playing around and changing over time, we're actually in the middle of, I don't know what to call it, a year-long campaign / sermon series all about belonging, because we've had conversations on this podcast just about what it means to actually belong to a church. We've had conversations specifically over membership as a sacrament or membership as an expectation in the church or not an expectation in the church, depending on what kind of environment you grew up in. So that's a word we've been playing around with. And we are kind of walking through that series through the rest of this year. And I think we're all pretty excited about it. So we'd love for you to join us in that as we discover a little bit more of what it means to belong. We hope to see you here on a Sunday morning. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and have a great day, week, whatever. It's your choice.
Yeah. Sleep if you're listening to this before you go to bed, whatever.
Have a good sleep.
Yeah.
Have a good rest of your potty break.
Later.